Hello and welcome back to Skepticus. I'm your boy, Adam of NOLA. And today we are going to be addressing terms that Christians just don't seem to understand. I know that sounds a little combative, right? Although I guess a lot of my stuff sounds combative, but I don't necessarily mean it as such. These things that I'm going to talk about, I'm not saying that Christians don't have a definition for the word. In fact, for most of these, Christians will be very familiar with these terms. But I'm going to point out some ways in which these terms are often twisted, or sometimes they are literally used in a malicious way. But sometimes there is no malice involved. Some of the examples that I'm going to bring up today really are about two different tribes that are trying to communicate, trying to hash things out, if you will. But sometimes they're just speaking a different language. Now, I don't mean that I'm speaking English and all my Christian friends are speaking French. We're all speaking English. But if you know anything about communication, just because you're all speaking English doesn't necessarily mean that you're speaking the same language. So this is one of those areas, as I've gotten a little older, a little grayer, or a lot grayer, I've noticed that there's often people talking around each other because they use these terms in very different, combative, and conflicting ways. So I'm going to point some of these out today. Obviously, I am biased myself. I'm fully aware of that. This is clearly from this atheist perspective. But hang with me and see if you can't understand at least a little bit of why I say that these are two different languages that we're speaking. Our first term is allegory. Now, I'm not implying, of course, that Christians don't know the meaning of the word allegory. But when it comes to their religion, they absolutely do not understand the meaning of the word allegory. Now, I'm never going to tell you that all of your holy book is an allegory, and I'm not going to pick out this story or that story and try to shout it down and tell you that that's an allegory. But most Christians that I know actively refute the idea that there are allegories in the story unless those stories are clearly defined as allegories or parables. I did another video on this, but keep in mind, Jesus, the Son of God, who is, according to most Christians, part of this Godhead, the Trinity, so kind of like God himself, Jesus was very fond of speaking in parables. Even God himself, although it's not as frequent, will use poetic speech in the Bible. He will employ metaphors at times to get his point across. Yet, even though Jesus clearly spoke in parables and enjoyed doing so frequently to teach his crowd, and even though God is on record as speaking in poetic, metaphorical terms, when you start even implying that certain stories in the Bible might just be allegorical, man, you can ruffle some feathers. And again, it's not just with the hyperliteralist or the fundamentalist. I've met Christians who fully believe in evolution, and yet they also fully believe in a global flood. Now, those two things aren't directly connected, but it's pretty hard on one hand to say that I believe in a global flood, which literally can't happen under the constructs of our environment and our atmosphere, etc., and then turn around and say that you believe in evolution. There is a dissonance there that so many Christians just don't seem to really comprehend. But hey, if you want to believe that there aren't any allegories in that book, you do you, bro. The next term is apologist. And this, to me, is a prickly one. When a Christian hears the word apologist, they tend to think of someone who is a defender of the faith, like a rhetorical crusader. I have to admit, even as someone who is a Christian for 40 years, I never heard the term apologist back then. And the reason was because I didn't go out there and try to find people who were dogmatically trying to defend the faith. I mean, I would research things when I had questions, or I would talk to people around me who were also of a similar mindset, and we would hash things out. But I never even realized that there's this class of people. I can't call them a class of scholars. I can't call them a class of researchers. They're just a class of people who revel in this idea that they are defenders of the faith. Of course, anyone who is actually not in the faith sees them as often intellectually bankrupt. Now, that's not to say that apologists are inferior in intellect. That's not to say that they're stupid in any way. Many apologists are frighteningly intelligent. And I say frighteningly because they have incredible mental capacity, and yet so often they use that mental capacity to dogmatically pick a position according to their reading of the text and then work backward from it and make any rhetorical leaps that they have to until they feel that they have satisfied the question in their mind, even if no one else outside the faith thinks it makes any sense whatsoever. There are a handful of apologists I have seen online that don't necessarily offend me. I think my best example is Gavin Ortland. He is respectful. He's accommodating of other views. Seems like he's genuinely a nice guy. Admittedly, a lot of the other apologists that I've seen come off as Theo bros, but they're not all like that, of course. But even the best ones, they're not really attacking this in an intellectually sound and honest way. They're picking a position according to what their dogma tells them that they have to find in the text. And then they're doing everything that they can to work backwards from it until they feel that they've quieted the doubt in their own mind and of their audience. The next term is atheist. Oh man, this is a sore point. I cannot tell you how many Christians in real life and on various forms of media I have seen that either cannot or refuse to be able to define what an atheist is. And that may sound snotty because I'm an atheist. So you're thinking, well, what's your vaunted opinion of what an atheist is? But this is not hard, people. There is not some massive book from 5,000 or 2,000 or 1,000 years ago that you have to read in order to understand what an atheist is. It is such a basic term. It's someone who does not believe in gods. Now, this gets twisted every such way as people try to have their little arguments online. They will tell you that, oh, you believe all these other things, and they will associate 1,000 different worldviews with atheism. And some of those might have some correlations, but that does not mean on any level that all of the other crap that you try to attach to atheism actually has anything to do with atheism whatsoever. For example, an apologist, or other Christians in general, they'll say something like, oh, if you're an atheist, you believe that everything came from nothing. That does not follow. Atheism simply means that you do not believe in gods. If you are telling me, which first of all, there's an incredible arrogance there to tell me what I'm thinking, but if you are telling me that I believe something came from nothing, you are injecting your own dialogue, your own dogma into the conversation. You are projecting your feelings and your thoughts about atheism onto me. Now, are there atheists who might tell you that something came from nothing? Sure, maybe, but it is logically inconsistent at best to try to say that, oh, you're an atheist, so you think everything came from nothing. Where did you get that idea, idiot? Like, no one told you that. You are literally pulling that out of thin air. Or if someone did tell you that, it's because they had their viewpoint as this one atheist over here. And that does not mean it applies to all atheists. If you are not telling me something about atheism that simply confirms the fact that I don't believe in gods, then everything else that you are tacking onto it is you projecting your crap into the conversation. And you should really educate yourself better if you're going to start flinging these terms around, because it's so intellectually lazy and it's such a weak little dodge to sit here and throw these things out like atheists do this and atheists don't like that. And this is what an atheist lifestyle leads to. Yes, I've heard people talk about an atheist lifestyle as if every atheist just does the same thing every day. We have all the same activities. We hang out in groups together. It's all very sad. And again, very intellectually lazy. And so many times when people throw around all these other correlations that they believe define atheism, what they're really doing is that they're just trying to score cheap points with their own audience. Because anyone who actually understands what atheism is, or anyone who is an atheist, will understand immediately when they hear this crap coming out of your mouth that you don't know what you're talking about, or even worse, you don't even care to speak truth, which is really lame. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, I'm taking these in alphabetical order, but some of these do kind of just fall in line perfectly, because the next word that I want to discuss that Christians don't seem to be able to understand is belief. Yes, I said that Christians don't understand belief. First of all, with regard to the previous point on atheism, in an attempt to strawman you and to try to define your position so they can drag it down, they will try to assign all sorts of laughably ridiculous beliefs to you. And they will claim that this is the atheist worldview, or this is what all atheists believe. And almost always it has no bearing on reality. But even deeper than that, beyond any attacks on atheism or what have you, I see this on an almost daily basis on the internet, is that there is an endless stream of Christians who will tell you breathlessly that your problem is that you haven't believed in their God, and you haven't believed in their holy tenets, and you haven't accepted all of their truth claims. But the simple fact is, that's not how belief works. You can't talk me into believing your imaginary, invisible sky daddy. I know that's dismissive, but believe whatever you want. I don't care if you believe in God. That's fine. But the idea that you can get me to believe by telling me I'm going to go to hell, for example, is patently absurd, and it indicates that you don't understand how belief actually works in the human brain. And if you don't want to believe that yourself, all you have to do is have the social awareness, which many don't, to just flip the situation and put yourself in someone else's shoes for once. What do I mean by that? Well, what if I told you that you're going to go to hell if you don't start praising Allah? Are you going to become a Muslim? Yeah, I didn't think so. Because in your worldview, if you're a Christian, you're thinking, no, Allah doesn't exist, or Allah is a false god, or no, you have to follow my worldview. But the thing is that if you are not inclined already to be a Muslim, or you are not already in a mindset where you're exploring other religions and you're thinking about converting to another faith, but if you are a hardcore Christian, then there's probably nothing that I can tell you that would actually get you to believe that you need to start worshiping Allah. It wouldn't matter if I threatened you with 10 different versions of Muslim hell. It wouldn't matter if I told you that all of your Christian ideas don't exist. You would just be recalcitrant. You would be so defensive that you wouldn't want to hear anything else I was saying, and the conversation would go nowhere. And yet, Christians have no problem pulling this crap out when they're talking to atheists, or when they're talking to Muslims, or when they're talking to anyone of any other faith. They believe that you can believe if they just assert it hard enough, if they just tell you with enough force that this is what you have to do. The simple fact is, I don't believe that your God even exists. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I am going to burn in your hell. But nothing that you are ever going to tell me, and nothing you're going to put in the comments on this video below, is going to do anything to change that. I'm not saying that people don't change their beliefs over time. That can and does happen. But even when we change our beliefs, it tends to be triggered by things that are at least partially outside of our control. In other words, it's pretty rare that someone wakes up one day and says, you know, I've been an atheist my whole life, or I've been an atheist for the last 10 years. But now I think I'm going to try to be Christian again. I think I believe in Yahweh. I think I believe in the resurrection and the virgin birth. I've just decided that I believe. That doesn't happen. I can't even make myself believe your fairy tales. So there's nothing that you can tell me that will make me believe your fairy tales. And if you don't understand that, it's because you don't understand what belief is and how belief works in the human brain. The next term that Christians just don't seem to understand is Christian. Oh yeah, I'm going there. I mean, I know that every religion in the world is going to be fractured. You can even argue that every single person on this earth has some degree of their own religion. Even if you're a Hindu, there's probably a billion different ideas on what Hinduism is. If you're a Muslim, same thing. If you're a Christian, the same thing. But you would think that even for basic definitional stuff, you could get some kind of common belief on what a Christian is. Even when we talk about what does it take to be saved, there are still fierce debates amongst Christians as to what it takes to be saved. When it comes to how a Christian should act, how do I define what Christians do in our daily lives, in society? No one has any clear definition of that. Now, you may think in your head that you have a clear definition, but I'm saying no one in the group sense. Like, there are no groups that truly have a solid definition of what it means to be Christian, which is why it can be so infuriating to talk to those who are Christians when you are not, or when you don't identify as one. It also becomes infuriating, even now that I am no longer Christian, to watch the interdisciplinary squabbles that go on as one group tries to tell the other group, no, you're not a Christian. No, you're not a Christian. No, you're not a real Christian. We're the real Christians. We're going to show you how to be real Christians. And it just goes on and on. I know you can say that some of this is inevitable. It's a 2,000-year-old religion now that's based on a religion that was 1,000 years old before that. The book hasn't been updated in ages because your God can't be bothered to talk to anyone anymore. So inevitably, humans splinter, they fracture, they go fractal. I understand that. But it's still sad sometimes to see the extent to which Christians themselves cannot actually agree amongst themselves what a Christian even is. The next two terms I am lumping together. They are cognitive bias and logical fallacies. Now, disclaimer here, first of all, neither cognitive bias nor logical fallacy are the exclusive domain of Christians. Every human I have ever known will, at least at times, fall into the lazy trap of using logical fallacies to make their points, myself included. There's something about being in a discussion with someone where you're just trying to score those cheap points, and sometimes you're doing it consciously. More often, you're doing it subconsciously. You're spitting out these words trying to make your point, and you fall into logical fallacy. Same thing with cognitive bias. Now, logical fallacy is more of a rhetorical device. Cognitive bias is a little deeper in terms of things that lead us astray. But of course, we all fall prey to cognitive biases. And this is not just in the area of religion. It applies to almost any area of our life. Cognitive biases are fascinating, first of all, because they can expose some incredible things about the way that the human brain works. But they're also kind of insidious and dangerous, and they can creep up in almost any part of our life. So this is not purely a critique for Christians. That being said, if you look at the discourse around Christianity, and if you look at the talking points that frequently come up, anyone is trying to defend their faith like an apologist, or anytime someone is trying to draw you into their faith, or anytime that someone is trying to shout someone down in my comment section below, so many times with Christians, it feels like not just a bias here or there, not just a fallacy here or there. So many times their entire argument is constructed on logical fallacies and cognitive biases. I know that sounds like a dig. And I know you'll probably sit there and say, well, atheists do the same thing. You're just as bad. But let me give you a perfect example of this. Anytime your entire argument comes from your own holy book, you are committing a grave logical fallacy. Now, I'm not saying that you can never reference your own holy book for guidance and wisdom and all that. And it's fine if you're sitting around with a bunch of Christians and you want to know, well, what did God say about this? Well, I think this verse says this. And the other one says, I think this verse says that. That's fine. That's not a logical fallacy in that context. But anytime, for example, that you want to talk to me and you know I'm an atheist, and you want to make any point at all by saying, but the Bible says this, you are committing a really grave logical fallacy. And not just because I don't agree with you. I'm talking, these are logical fallacies. They're codified. I'm doing a whole other video on this that I've recorded, but it's not out yet. But these are codified logical fallacies. I mean, one of the biggest logical fallacies of all time is literally spawned from and named for religion, which is, say it with me, the God of the gaps. It's fine if you want to debate the origin of the cosmos and you want to talk about deep theological issues, or you want to talk about the boundaries of science. But anytime you start squeezing God into those solutions, you are using God of the gaps. It's an entire logical fallacy named for you. Think about that. What are the logical fallacies named for atheists? And I'm not saying that atheists don't use logical fallacies. We certainly do. And I'm guilty of it sometimes myself. Although the funny part on this is that I will see, like in my own comments, where people will accuse me of using logical fallacies where clearly I did not. And sometimes they will falsely accuse me of using a logical fallacy. And in the act of doing so, they will then throw in one or two of their own logical fallacies. Sometimes you just can't make this shit up, you know? The next term that Christians just can't seem to understand is contradiction. And yes, I'm speaking specifically of the Bible. I love what I've seen on some apologist sites where they talk about the Bible's contradictions and they put it in quotes like it's just something that someone made up, that there are contradictions in the Bible. Look, you can flog that tired inerrancy horse all day long. He's dead. He's been dead a long time. But if you don't believe that there are contradictions in the Bible, it's because you literally are not paying attention. I'll be the first one to tell you, I had read the Bible multiple times before I started this channel, but I've been reading it again for one of my video series since then. And even for me, an atheist, who could tell you about many of the contradictions in the Bible, it wasn't until this last time reading through it that even more of them just jump out to me. They're not even subtle. They're not hard to find. They're all over the text. And to be clear, I'm not telling you for a second that any one of these contradictions refutes your Bible. It doesn't refute your claims. It doesn't refute your God. It doesn't refute anything. It's just a perfect illustration of the fact the Bible was written over millennia by many dozens of, possibly hundreds of men, most of whom lived 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Of course, there are contradictions. And again, if you go through, and I know that most Christians cannot or will not do this. First of all, because most of them haven't even read most of their Bible. They'll tell you they have, but they haven't. But if you tried to go through with a sense of intellectual honesty and just start at page 1 of Genesis and read carefully through the last page of Revelation, they will jump off the page at you. Again, I'm not saying that refutes your Bible. I'm not saying it refutes your faith. But if you can't even acknowledge the plain text contradictions, then you lose all integrity. You lose all sense of honesty in your arguments. We can't take you seriously. So many times, Christians, they will try to hand wave away every contradiction that they find, and then they'll tell you that they've solved them all. Unfortunately, the Christian idea of contradictions as it pertains to the Bible is this. If we can make up any story, no matter how implausible, that somehow accounts for synthesizes and harmonizes these contradictions that you refuse to acknowledge, then in their minds, they will tell you that the contradiction doesn't exist, that it goes away. And that goes entirely against the plain logic of reading. If chapter 1 says that Bob's hair is red, and then chapter 2, which is supposed to be an hour later, says that Bob's hair is green, that's a contradiction. Now, can you come up with a story that says maybe Bob had his hair dyed in the hour between chapter 1 and chapter 2? Sure, you can make up that story. But if it doesn't exist anywhere in the text, all you were doing is making up a story. You are bringing your own biases and your own cognitive dissonance to the text, and you are smoothing everything over to make yourself feel good. There is a whole range of inconsistencies in the Bible. Some of them are truly just like, that's kind of weird. Doesn't seem right, but you can kind of move past them. Some of them are just outright plain contradictions. And even if you can concoct a story that somehow in your mind synthesizes them, that doesn't mean the contradiction goes away. It just means that you have come up with enough spiritual putty to go over all the cracks so that you don't have to think about it anymore when you look at the walls of your religious house. But that doesn't change that the contradiction is still there. The next term that Christians just can't seem to come to terms with is evidence. Yeah, it amazes me to think that somehow Christians ever survive in fields like jurisprudence, because how you can go from courtrooms and then make the arguments that you do for your text is baffling. I don't know how many times I've seen all these claims of all the eyewitness reports of Jesus resurrecting. Of course, what's one of the first ones that they bring up? Oh, there were hundreds of them. Paul tells us that there were 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection. Okay, where are their accounts? Oh, that's right, there aren't any. It's Paul telling us that there were 500 eyewitnesses. We don't have any of their accounts. We don't have any other corroboration of these 500 witnesses from anywhere else. We don't even know exactly who wrote all these texts. So a lot of times, the things that we are calling eyewitness accounts aren't just non-accounts. They are hearsay of hearsay, which would be ridiculous in any other context. Now, I bring up the resurrection because that's a classic one, but the point is, so much stuff that comes from the Bible is treated as evidence for that happening when all we have is an account, usually a nameless, unattributed account of something that supposedly happened. Sometimes that account is telling us that someone else said something. So now we're getting well into hearsay territory. I'm not telling you that none of the things in your Bible happened. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not even telling you that the miracles in your Bible didn't happen. I'm not telling you that Jesus did not resurrect. I'm not telling you that there was not a virgin birth. Believe all the miracles that you want to believe, that's fine. But just understand that there's a huge difference between saying, I believe this thing to be true. That's fine. That's in your mind. You believe whatever you want. Versus telling me that you have evidence for this thing that you believe to be true. And then when I say, okay, show me this evidence, you pull out your holy book with your third-hand accounts. In this, I'm supposed to take as evidence. Come on, man. Come on. You can do better than that. Or maybe you can't, and that's the issue. But yeah, come on, man. The next term that Christians can't seem to come to terms with is evolution. And I understand if you're screaming bloody murder already, it's because there are many Christians out there who have accepted the plain truth that evolution is a thing. It's a massively documented scientific evidentiary thing. But also, sadly, at least in this country, in the US, there is a disturbing percentage of people who refute evolution altogether. But I bring this up not as a whole video to talk about evolution and why it's real. I bring up the fact that Christians, especially the creationist types, can't even seem to use evolution in a way that anyone outside of your Christian fundamentalist circles would agree with. For example, I hear this all the time from fundamentalist sectors where they'll say, oh, well, if you believe in evolution, then how do you account for the origin of life? Or you think that life came from nothing. Well, the origin of life or whether life came from nothing has nothing to do with evolution, you idiot. They are two completely separate concepts. Evolution just documents in painstaking detail now how species evolve over time, how they acquire new traits and change their traits according to mutations. That's what evolution is. Evolution, you're right, does not tell us how life came about because evolution never even tries to answer that question. Sure, it's probably valid to say that people who are interested in studying evolutionary biology probably also have an interest in how life actually originated in the first place, but they are not the same thing. And if you don't understand that, you're not really qualified to be in the discussion. Creationists will even take it further than that. You'll be trying to say something about evolution, and then they'll want to talk about the creation of the cosmos itself, which again has nothing to do with evolution. And if you don't understand that, go back to the kids' table because the grown folk are trying to have a conversation. The next term that Christians should brush up on is faith. Yeah, I said that. An atheist, telling that you really need to learn some things about faith. There are two aspects of which I'm going to talk about this term, all right? The first aspect is this. So many times I've seen this discourse happening where on one hand, Christians want to talk about faith, 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 faith. You're saved by faith. We should all have faith, 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 faith. And then they want to turn around in almost the same breath and talk about all the evidence for their miracles and how they can prove everything about Christianity and how they can prove everything about the beginning of the cosmos. And they want to just completely marry these two concepts together. And as a former Christian, this actually baffles me because I have said this to Christians and they do not like it when I say this, but I don't care. If you need physical proof for all the things that you believe in, then your faith sucks. I don't mean that your religion sucks. That's a different conversation. I mean that your personal faith sucks. If you're only going to believe in Jesus if they find all of the right historical markers around the Levant, then your faith sucks. If you need some kind of archaeological evidence to prove that the Exodus happened, then your faith sucks. Because ultimately, if your religion means a damn thing, it shouldn't be dependent upon whether we can sit here 2,000 or 3,000 years later and verify everything with archaeological evidence. Because newsflash, a lot of it you cannot. I'm not saying that there is no historicity in the Bible, but a lot of it you cannot. And if that undermines your faith, then maybe we should talk about some deconstruction because your faith kind of sucks ass. I'm sorry, not sorry. I mean, there's no better way that I can say that. The other reason that I wanted to talk about faith, though, is this. Christians will kind of deceitfully swap this term out, or at least use it in a very ambiguous way. Sometimes it's deceitful. Sometimes it's subconscious. I'm not saying that they're always full of malice when they do this. But if you just look up the dictionary definition of faith, and I'm not going to bore you by doing that here, there's at least two good ways to define this term. When an atheist talks to a theist about faith, they're usually talking about how faith is referred to, especially in the Bible, especially in your churches, which is belief without evidence. Now, to be clear, I'm not mad if you believe things without evidence. That's fine. But understand it for what it is. It's belief without evidence. It's belief in a God who's up there that you can't see and you can't hear and you can't confirm in any single way. Again, I'm not trying to prosecute that right now, but you can't prove it. I can't disprove it. You can't prove it. You have faith, and that's fine. But then they'll turn around in conversations with atheists and they'll say something like, well, you all have faith too. You just have faith in different things. But the dodge here, the sneaky thing that they're doing is they're essentially swapping out two different definitions of faith, all right? It's one thing to believe, to have faith in a invisible, unheard, unseen, unexperienced, untouched God that only exists because it's written in your book, versus saying, well, I have faith that my wife will be coming home from work at 5. Now, it's true that I'm not tracking her whereabouts. I don't know where she is at this time. I don't need to watch where her car is at all times to know that she'll be coming back at 5. But I know where she is right now, and I know what time she always gets home. And unless she has communicated with me and given me any reason to believe that she will not be home at 5, it's reasonable to say that I have faith in her coming home at 5. But that's a different kind of faith than what we're talking about in the Bible now, isn't it? Because another way of thinking about faith is you can have faith in things happening that you haven't personally observed because you have a reasonable body of evidence to know that they are likely to happen. That's very different than having faith in your magic sky daddy or having faith that someone's going to answer your prayer. Very different kinds of faith. And yet Christians will breathlessly swap out those two meanings. I think a lot of times they know exactly what they're doing, but sometimes they do it kind of subconsciously, to be fair. But be very careful when you try to accuse an atheist of having faith. They'll also extend this to the scientific realm, right? Or other empirical evidence. They'll say, oh, well, you have faith in scientists. I don't have faith in anyone. I don't have faith in scientists. Well, they'll be like, well, then how do you know that E equals MC squared? Did you do all the differential equations? Did you verify this in the lab? Like, no, I haven't. Because there are all sorts of things in this world that I cannot observe directly. So I have to trust the credible, verified information that comes from other credible, verified sources. And you can tell me all day that this is circular, but this isn't half as circular as your magical sky daddy. And anytime they start trying to go down this empirical, theoretical rabbit hole where they're trying to say, see, you have faith, they are completely ignoring how the scientific community works. So yes, I do have faith, if you want to call it that E does equal MC squared, even though I have never performed lab experiments that confirm it for me. But I also know that there have been many lab experiments already that have absolutely confirmed every part of Einstein's special and general relativity pieces that we can verify at this point. But I also know that if somebody could in some way crack a hole in his theories in a credible way, meaning peer-reviewed papers, experiential evidence, lab tests, etc., they would overnight become one of the leading scientists of our age. In other words, science has its own incentives for disproving itself. Now, everything that you disprove wouldn't be as big as disproving E equals MC squared, if that could even happen. But the point is that scientists, like the rest of humanity, have incentives and they have competitive natures sometimes, and they want to be recognized. They want to win Nobel Prizes. They want to be tenured. And to think that they would all be involved in some conspiracy lying to me about E equals MC squared is just so far out of reality that it actually makes your magic sky daddy seem semi-plausible if you're just going to detach your brain from reality that severely. So because this is getting long, and I don't want this to be an epic video, which no one will ever watch all of, this is going to get broken up into 2 parts. So thank you for watching part 1. Keep your eyes peeled for part 2, which will be getting published very shortly, and we'll see the full list of all the terms that Christians just don't seem to understand.